Hello, everybody. How are you? How are things in your world? I hope good. Folks, this is another video about Denver in our Denver series, which I've extended a week. We only typically spend a week on each city or topic and then go on to something else. However, Denver is such an important city and has so much going on that it qualified as an extender city. So we'll be doing Denver all week. This particular video is about the National Basketball Association team, the Denver Nuggets. And before we go any further, if you're new to the channel or you're not 100% sure what's happening here, this video will be completely made up off the top of my head, or 97% made up off the top of my head, so it's not real. Don't expect to get a thorough, exact history of the Denver Nuggets. That's not what this is about. This is a parody video. We're just going to find out what is in my brain. And see if there's any humor in there. Maybe, maybe not. Well, let's find out. So, the Denver Nuggets. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. The Nuggets, actually, this is really interesting because it just shows the ebb and flow of professional sports. So, the Nuggets were originally in the National Basketball League, the NBL, okay, in 1948, 1949. So then the NBL combined with the Basketball Association of America, the BAA, to form a new association called the NBA, the National Basketball Association. Now the Nuggets played the 1949-1950 season as one of the original teams of the NBA. Did you know that? You didn't know that, did you? Well, now you know. Then, well, it folded. But that's professional sports, guys. It happens. So then, in the 60s, the ABA was formed. The ABA, and it was one of the charter. I think so. Let me slow down. It was one of the charter franchises in the ABA in 1967. So think about that. The team that was called the Denver Larks, named after the state bird, the Denver Larks. So think about that. It just occurred to me that the Denver Nuggets, original Denver Nuggets, were one of the charter members of the NBA in 1949 and 1950, and then the Denver Larks were one of the charter franchises in the ABA, the 1960s ABA. Are you following this? I've got it. If you look on the wall here, I've got it all mapped out with a series of markers. I've got yarn tied to pins that can forget it. So, but it's important. This is an important part of the Denver Nuggets legacy. So that team, the Denver Larks, of course, didn't last long as the Larks. And then they very quickly became the Denver, let me go back, Denver Rockets. So they changed the name to the Rockets, and then they changed the name to the Nuggets in 1974. And then, believe it or not, within 2 years of the name change, they played for the American Basketball Association Championship in 1976, losing to the New York Nets. Now, all of that is relatively accurate. But what's important, what people don't understand is, so the first thing it might come to your mind is, well, why did it keep folding? What's going on with basketball in Denver that these original teams keep folding? The one in 1948-49, and then the 1967 one, etc., etc. So, well, the Larks didn't really fold. They just became the Rockets, and they were resold. So I guess you could say they folded, but nonetheless, they carried on as the Rockets. Why would they name the team in Denver the Rockets? Right? I don't understand that. Houston, it makes sense. The Houston Rockets. Who knows? So let's examine that a little bit. The Nuggets were part of the NBL, of course, in the 1948-49 season, and then folded in 1949-1950. So if you look back at the original Nuggets, the team was had a following, but not enough of a following. And what the team tried to do, they just said, "Look, let's flip it on its head. Rather than the fans come to us to watch us play, we'll go to where the fans are." This was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time, and it was a way to drum up business, a way to get the game into where the fans live their lives, make it a part of their lives, and then they'll come to watch us play, was the thought. So they actually held a lot of games on city buses. They took out the seats and they had games on city buses in Denver, trying to get people interested. What they did was had several parades down the middle of Denver, which was simply the team playing basketball as it moved down the street. In other words, the game itself moved slowly down the street as it was in action. And that was actually a pretty good idea. They had games on the sides of mountain slopes in the winter. Okay, in the middle of the winter, they'd go and play the game on the side of a mountain, trying to get people. So in other words, they're dribbling, they're passing the ball as they ski down the mountainside. They had games on boats. They would pass the ball from one boat to another in the middle of Lake Denver. So they were trying all kinds of ideas to try to get the game into the lives of where the fans lived, in order to try to get them to then say, "Hey, why don't we just go down to watch these guys play at a building?" And unfortunately, that didn't work. Now, the Larks, they tried some other strategy similar to that when they kicked in the 1960s. What they did was they tried to tie into their name as a promotional key. So the Larks, again, because it was a state bird, that's where they came up with Larks. So they tried to then go with that bird theme, the flight theme, and they would have games out at the Houston airport, at the Denver airport, right? And they would say, "Hey, folks, if you look out the side of the terminal here, you'll see the Denver basketball team, the Larks, playing on the tarmac." Okay, so they'd actually play right out on the tarmac, folks. And to see the Larks play further, folks, don't forget to catch them down at the stadium. See what I mean? They tried to they kind of capitalized on the same ideas as their originators back in the 40s and 50s, with similar plans to expose themselves to fans, in this case at the airport. But of course, it's a long-term strategy. They didn't see a lot of immediate results, and team owners are not known for their patience, and a lot of those promotional ideas went by the wayside. So let's pick it up then. Now that we got a pretty good snapshot of how it all came about, the original Denver Nuggets did fairly well in the ABA, and then in the ABA-NBA merger, ABA-NBA, whatever it was, the Nuggets still did pretty well. However, they didn't do well enough. Now, this is what's interesting. They weren't a bad team. They weren't a good team either. And so they went a very long time just having mediocre results. Now, you say, well, a true champion would make the changes to try to get into the upper echelons of the sport. If they were making enough good decisions to qualify as a team in the middle, why don't we make better decisions and qualify as a team at the top? And your thinking is right. It's much more difficult than you think at the highest levels of a very highly competitive sport by like the NBA. So, for example, let's say you need a center. Now, in those days, the salaries were much lower, but the inventory of big men that could play center were also lower. So they used to walk around Denver just looking for really tall guys. And when that didn't work, they would go out to the mountain areas hoping to either run into a mountain man that hadn't been discovered, hadn't been exposed to society in general, like a lumberjack or mountain man that's back in the mountains outside of Denver that could potentially, like a tall guy, a tall mountain man that could be center for their team. And when that didn't work, they started looking for a Sasquatch because they heard the Sasquatch was tall. So they really went out of their way to look for a big center that would lead them to the next level of the of NBA competition. But of course, like I said, it was very difficult to find a offensive but defensive-minded offensive quarterback and defensive linebacker mentality in a big man that would. Because you need that anchor. If you're going to go to the top levels, you're going to need that anchor. You could get all the forwards and power forwards you want, but unless you got that base to build on, you ain't going nowhere. So they tried the Sasquatch, and really they had a Sasquatch that was a center for a couple good years, and they were also very good in local TV commercials, the Sasquatch guys, because they didn't mess up the script. You give them the script, and they did it word for word for word, and there was no second takes, no wasted time, no diva egos, right? They were just glad to have a square meal. And also the promise of the team to get them some shoes that fit those huge feet of theirs. And so they had a contract with some local shoe companies or even some out-of-town companies like Nike out of Oregon at the time, and said, can you make a shoe that'll fit this guy's feet, and his feet are like 2.5 feet long. And so they'd have to get big pieces of leather to make those shoes that would normally go on a couch. And they'd sew them into a shoe, and then those Sasquatch guys would be happy because... And think about it. You're a Sasquatch. You're walking around in the winter in the mountains outside of Denver. You're freezing your butt off, guys. And so when somebody comes to you and says, look, man, we're going to give you some shoes. We're going to get you a downfield jacket from North Face or another company like that, Patagonia. And all you need to do is throw this ball around and anchor this team and take us to the championship so that we can cash in for millions and millions of dollars. And every Sasquatch they talked to took that deal right away because really all they cared about were the shoes. And it was later that when the agents got involved, they started negotiating for better deals for the Sasquatch centers, like snowshoes, for example, so that they could have snowshoes in the winter and stuff like that. But fair is fair, and they did a good job for the team. Unfortunately, they just didn't have that basketball skill level. See, that's the thing. You're trying to find the blend of size, speed, and skill, and they just didn't have the basketball skills. But the Nuggets persisted, and they've really worked hard to make the team put them in position. They just haven't been in position to win a championship. And so they've drafted all kinds of players from other sports. You know, once they went outside the world of basketball to find a center, they really opened up their mind and started looking at players from other sports. So they approached Wayne Gretzky, for example, to play a power forward. And Gretzky was going to do it. Gretzky was all about multiple sports, developing your body so that it had the flexibility and strength that came from playing multiple sports in order to excel at his original sport, which of course was ice hockey. Now the problem with Gretzky is he had this killer mullet. And now in hockey, you can tuck that mullet into your helmet and it comes flowing out the back. In basketball, man, he tried, but that mullet would come flopping around and it would blind him. And he ended up a couple times running off the court and up into the stands like 4 or 5 levels and crashing into a popcorn vendor. And so the mullet was really the killer deal with Gretzky. They went to baseball. They tried to get some baseball players. I mean, here you had Pete Rose, who was available because he couldn't play basketball because of the cheating scandal. But they figured, here you have Mr. Hustle. This guy could probably play for the Nuggets. And he did. He played for the Nuggets for 2 seasons. But his whole problem was he'd go for every loose ball. He'd dive as he was, just like he was sliding into second. He'd go for every loose ball. But the problem was he'd slide so hard and fast, and he'd go slip sliding across the floor, going for a loose ball, and just burn a tread into the boards onto the court, and then he'd go flaming into the photographers. In other words, he's sliding so hard and fast, he's creating a flame. He's creating fire behind his body as it sets the boards on fire, and then he'd crash into the sports photographers, and all of them would get burned from the flames. And they constantly had to put out fires because of Pete Rose sliding hard on that wooden floor, setting things on fire, in his inimitable Mr. Hustle style. So that didn't work out either. But again, the Nuggets kept trying. They tried hockey. They tried baseball. They said, look, what about a bicyclist? They had Tour de France in there, okay? They had Lance. Lance Armstrong was a Nugget for a while. And they petitioned the league to let him ride his bike on the court. And so they'd pass him the ball, and this guy, he was an unbelievable talent on that bike. He could rush the baskets, guys, and he could lift. He could somehow like go down on his, like he'd sort of crouch down on the bike. He'd have the ball in one hand. He'd crouch down, and then spring up, and go flying in the air with the bike, holding onto the bike with one hand. The guy had unbelievable muscle strength. And he could dunk it doing that. It was a very exciting time in Denver Nuggets history, watching Lance Armstrong flying through the air with his bike with one hand and dunk it with the other hand. In fact, sometimes he'd spin the front tire just to rub it in on the other teams. He'd spin the front tire in midair. And that created a lot of excitement. And in fact, the Nuggets can really point to Lance Armstrong as one of the moves they made that generated a lot of interest in the team that has made them such a high-profile team today. Because at that time, they were barely even known, even in town. The problem was that Lance Armstrong was then later found to be using HGH, or I'm not sure that's what it was, but he was accused of using performance-enhancing drugs, let's say. And so a lot of people were saying, well, that's how he's able to fly through the air with the bike in one hand. Now, of course, he denied it, and I don't know either way. I'm just telling you what happened. And so then the team had to let him go. They said, look, man, we don't exactly know, but the pressure is so high, we can't afford the bad PR. They had to let him go. And, He was only playing for the Nuggets in the off season of the bicycle racing that he was doing in France and stuff. And plus, he said, hey, I like the bagels. I like the French bread they've got over there. I like the baguettes. And he preferred that kind of food, so he went back to France and was happier over there anyway. But again, they kept trying different sports, different high profile. They wanted to get somebody that was at the top of their sport that could bring that athleticism and that skill and a different angle on basketball, but also bring their celebrity, okay, to the Nuggets, which would help sell tickets and raise their profile. I mean, you got to remember, guys, the NBA wasn't always the huge attraction that it is now. I mean, some of these expansion teams in the early days, they barely got anybody in the stands. They were lucky to have 10, 20 people at some of those Nuggets games, guys. So it didn't seem crazy at the time. Now looking back, you say, well, why were they getting a guy on a bicycle? But at the time, it was lauded in town. They in the press, they loved it. They loved that this team was doing everything they could to make another professional sport successful in Denver, which everybody looked at as, the headquarters for sports in the West. Right? They wanted it to be the sports city in the West. They realized that other cities in the East perhaps could hold that mantle, but in the West, in the Western states, specifically in the mountains, they wanted to be known as Sports Central. So they were happy. The mayor, the city council, the man on the street, they all applauded these efforts. So, they did a couple of things. Because it's an outdoor sports type of town, too, they looked to the Olympics. Now, they tapped a retired skier at one time, a guy named Jean-Claude Keely, who was a world-class skier. They brought him in to play for the Nuggets, telling him that he could use his skis on the court as long as he waxed them pretty good, because they were kind of burned when Pete Rose would go sliding around setting the place on fire. They wanted to make sure that the friction wasn't a problem anymore, so they told him, look, just put like 3 or 4 inches of wax on those skis, and you could go up in the stands if you want and come flying down, and we'll pass you the ball. And with your skill, you'll be able to make some baskets just using that the slope of the stands. And then as the play progresses, you can enter from the sidelines, and we'll pass you the ball, and you can go do your flips and your jumps in the air and make some baskets that way. Well, that was a very good idea because he was unbelievably good at it as well. I mean, it's funny how these players from these sportsmen, these athletes from other sports came on to the Nuggets and did real well. Billie Jean King. They got Billie Jean King from tennis. Billie Jean King was, pound for pound, one of the best athletes in the world at the time. And they let her bring on her tennis racket. She'd hit that basketball, guys, with that tennis racket from one end of the court and send it through the basket with nary a whisper of hitting the rim, total swish, and the place would erupt. There was a couple of times in the 80s where they put Billie Jean King on their shoulders and carried her out of the stadium. I think it was the 70s. In the 70s, carried her out of the stadium, cheering. Okay? Because of her ability to take that tennis racket, smash the basketball right through the hoop with a total swish. Total swish, guys. So that's from tennis. See what I'm saying? They were looking for players from any sport that would work, or honestly, any activity. It didn't even have to be a sport. So they had, for example, Pee Wee Herman was on the Nuggets for 3-4 years and did very well. Now, he also rode a bike, but he had a different style. He didn't fly through the air like Lance Armstrong, but he made funny noises, and he also had a backup team of characters. Like he had a chair. He'd bring a talking chair out on the court, and that would, when you got a 6'6" or above frame, which many NBA players do, you're always looking for a comfortable chair. So Pee Wee Herman would bring this chair out with him when he was competing for the Nuggets, and what happened was players on other teams would look at this chair and just say, "Man, I got to sit down. Look at that comfortable chair." And in effect, it would take out one player from the other team, opening up the defense, making them spread out so much that Pee Wee Herman could come dribbling down on his bicycle and then ring that bell, ring, 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 and just score at will, because one of their players, sometimes two players, would be sitting in that chair. Sometimes they'd have two players sitting in the chair side by side, just laughing that they are so comfortable right on center court. They didn't even have to go up into the locker room or go into one of the sky boxes, whatever it was. So the Nuggets really have tried hard. This is a team, so many professional teams, you're thinking, what's going on with this team? What's with the owner? They don't seem to be doing anything to make this a championship team. Why have a professional sports team if you're not going to try to make it a competitor? Well, the Nuggets have always been very strong-willed, and been working very hard to make them NBA champions and three-peat champions, and to be in the upper echelons of the NBA. But so far, it just hasn't. They just haven't been able to ring the cash register at that level. Haven't been able to grab that brass ring, but it's just a matter of time. So, guys, that's pretty much it. That's all we're doing in this video, is giving you a quick snapshot of how the team originated and how it's sort of developed over the years. And we'll, in future videos, we'll look at some of the key players that have played for the Nuggets over the years. The years that they did come close to winning it all, and why they excelled, and maybe what they could do to get back to those days where they were knocking on the door. They didn't quite make the sale, but they were knocking on the door to become the worldwide champions. Because it's an exciting team, and it's an exciting franchise. The NBA is super hot right now. We'll probably have 4, 5, 10 videos on the Nuggets alone. So come on back. It's very exciting to cover. We just did a video on the history of the amazing history, was the title of the video, of the Denver Broncos, and it's so exciting now to do a snapshot history of the Denver Nuggets. We'll get into the Rockies. We'll get into the rest of the teams in what is one of the great sports towns in the world. All right, so keep in mind, I made all this up, and if you look it up, actually the very beginning of this video was pretty accurate, and then after that I pretty much made it up off the top of my head. It's a parody video. That's what we do here. And I mention that because some people come in the middle, they don't know what's going on, and that'll give you an idea of what you just heard. If you're shaking your head going, what the hell is this? So come on back, guys. We got so much more. Thanks.